She was 43 years old. She had 5 children she rarely saw, a husband who had left, a room in a lodging house she could not always afford. On the last night of her life, she was turned away from that room because she was 4 pence short. 4 pence. Then the cost of a loaf of bread. She walked back out into the streets of Whitechapel to find it. She was never seen alive again. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols. And she was not a fallen woman. She was a woman that Victorian society had failed so completely, so systematically, that the streets were the only place left for her to go. This is not a story about a killer. The killer has had enough attention. This is a story about the world that created the streets he hunted, about the women who walked them, about a society that built an entire machinery of poverty and shame, and then called the women it crushed fallen. Because here is what Victorian London looked like after dark. Not the London of gaslit drawing rooms and polished silverware. Not the London of Dickens' dinner parties and parliamentary debates. The other London. The one that existed in the hours between midnight and dawn. In the alleys behind the theatres. In the doss houses of Whitechapel. On the promenades of the Haymarket. In every shadow that respectable Victorian society pretended not to see. There were an estimated 80,000 women working as prostitutes in London in 1850. 80,000 in a single city. The Lancet Medical Journal estimated that 1 in every 60 houses in London was a brothel. This was not hidden. This was not underground. This was the open, visible, daily reality of the most powerful city on earth. Imagine you are a young woman in London in 1880. You are 22 years old. You work in a garment factory in the East End, 6 days a week, 14 hours a day, for 4 shillings a week. Your room costs 2 shillings. Food costs the rest. There is nothing left. There has never been anything left. Then the factory closes. Or your supervisor dismisses you. Or you fall ill for 2 weeks and lose your position. And suddenly, there is no room either. You have no family nearby, no savings, no legal right to most professions, no safety net of any kind. Victorian society has given you almost no legitimate path to survival as a single woman. And so you make the only calculation available to you. Not a moral decision, an arithmetic one. A prostitute in Victorian London could earn in a single night what a factory girl earned in a week. This is how 80,000 women ended up on those streets. Not through weakness, not through moral failure, through mathematics. The street itself had a geography that Victorian London understood and never acknowledged. At the top of it was the Haymarket, the most famous prostitution district in the world. Every night, well-dressed men strolled openly between the theatres and restaurants, making their selections. Police were present, but largely uninvolved. The Hasken Sishatet. Reason was simple and never spoken aloud. The men who used the Haymarket were the same men who ran the city. Members of Parliament, judges, clergymen, the very men who gave speeches in the morning about the moral decay of fallen women, were the men creating the demand for them at night. Victorian society knew this. Victorian society looked away. Further down the scale were the music halls and theatres, where the promenade areas at the back of the stalls were open working spaces. The Empire Theatre in Leicester Square, one of the most celebrated venues in London, was also one of the most openly used for soliciting. When reformers successfully campaigned to have the promenade closed in 1894, a group of young men tore down the partition the theatre had installed in protest. One of those young men was 19-year-old Winston Churchill. He thought it was funny. The women who worked that promenade did not find it funny. But nobody asked them. And then there was Whitechapel. At the very bottom of the geography. The East End of London in 1888 was one of the most overcrowded places on earth. Families of 8 lived in single rooms. Sewage ran in the streets. Starvation was not unusual. Thousands of desperate people poured in from Ireland, from Eastern Europe, from across the British countryside, all of them fleeing something worse. There were more than 60 brothels within half a mile of where the Ripper struck. More than 1,200 women known to be working the streets, in that single neighbourhood alone. They slept in common lodging houses called doss houses, where a bed cost 4p a night. If you didn't have 4p, you slept in the street, or you went back out to earn it. In 1864, the British government passed the Contagious Diseases Acts. These laws allowed police to arrest any woman they suspected of being a prostitute and force her to undergo a medical examination. If she refused, she went to prison. The examination itself was so invasive that campaigners called it instrumental rape. Men were never examined. Men were never arrested. The law existed entirely to protect male customers from the consequences of their own behavior, while punishing the women those customers had created the demand for. A woman named Josephine Butler spent 20 years of her life fighting to have those acts repealed. She was spat on in the streets, had her meetings broken up by violent mobs, was called by men in Parliament the most disgusting woman in public life. In 1886, the acts were repealed. She won, and the men who had tried to silence her had to watch her do it. Then there was the question of children. The age of consent in Victorian England was 13 years old. 13. The purchase of girls as young as 13 was entirely legal. Brothels advertised it openly. In 1885, a journalist named W. T. Stead decided to prove how easily it could be done. He purchased a 13-year-old girl for £5 to expose the trade to the public. His article, The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, sold out immediately. Crowds gathered outside newspaper offices demanding copies. Within weeks, 393,000 people had signed a petition demanding the age of consent be raised. Parliament raised it to 16 that same year. W. T. Stead went to prison for the purchase he had made to expose the crime. The brothel owner who sold the girl did not. And then came the autumn of 1888. 5 women were murdered in Whitechapel between August and November. The press named the killer Jack the Ripper. They covered the case obsessively. They published the letters. They speculated about the identity. They turned the murders into the greatest criminal mystery of the century. And in doing so, they did something that has lasted until today. They made the story about the killer, not the women. So let us talk about the women. Mary Ann Nichols was 43 years old. She had 5 children. She had spent time in a workhouse. On the night she died, she was 4 pence short of a bed. Annie Chapman had been a respectable wife and mother. Her husband died. Her children were taken from her. She turned to alcohol and then the streets. Elizabeth Stride was known among the people who knew her for her warmth. Catherine Eddowes called herself a bit of a poet. Mary Jane Kelly was said to have a beautiful singing voice. She was 25 years old. The youngest of the 5, she was Irish. She had come to London looking for something better. These were not unfortunates. That was the word Victorian newspapers used for them, unfortunates. As though what happened to them was a matter of luck, rather than a matter of policy. The police investigation moved slowly. The murders of women in Whitechapel were not, in 1888, the kind of thing that commanded the full resources of the Metropolitan Police. These were not society women. These were not women whose husbands would demand answers. These were women that Victorian society had already written off, long before a killer found them in the dark. Jack the Ripper was never caught. More than 100 years of speculation have produced dozens of suspects, and no definitive answer. But here is what we do know. He did not create the conditions that put those women on those streets at that hour. Victorian society did that. Decades before he arrived. After the murders, public attention briefly turned to Whitechapel. Journalists visited. Politicians gave speeches. Charities collected donations. And then the attention faded, as it always does. The poverty remained. The lack of legal protection remained. The double standard remained. The 1,200 women working the streets of Whitechapel kept walking them, because nothing that had put them there had been addressed. Nothing that had put them there had even been honestly named. Victorian morality was built on a double standard so total that most of the people living inside it never paused to see it as a double standard at all. It was simply life as it was correctly arranged. Time equals, quote, 0.7 seconds, quote, / greater than a man who used prostitutes was considered normal, a necessary accommodation of male nature. A woman who sold herself was ruined forever, fallen, unclean, beyond redemption. The same transaction, 2 completely different consequences. Men kept their reputations, their families, their careers, their names. Women lost everything those things were built on. And Victorian society called this morality. It would be comfortable to look at all of this and locate it safely in the past. To say that the distance between then and now is total and in many ways it is. The legal frameworks that left women with no path to survival except the streets have been dismantled. Slowly, incompletely. Across generations of women who fought from inside a system that told them their desires were irrelevant. But the particular habit of making women responsible for the conditions that men create, that habit did not simply dissolve when the century ended. Anyone paying close attention can still hear its echo. Ann Nichols deserves to be seen clearly, not as an unfortunate, not as a victim defined entirely by how she died, but as a woman of 43 who had lived a whole life before Whitechapel, who had children she loved, who had been a wife, who had tried repeatedly to find another way, who walked back out into the dark that night because she needed fourpence. And Victorian England had given her no other way to get it. Her resilience was real. Her humanity was real. And the system that put her on that street was not an accident. It was a choice, made by people who knew exactly what they were doing and called it the natural order of things. If this story moved you, if it showed you something history tried to keep invisible, subscribe to The Hidden Victorian. Every week, we tell the real stories, behind the world you think you know. Leave a comment below. Tell me which woman's story stayed with you. I read every single one. Next time, we go inside the Victorian workhouse. Families separated at the gate, children working before dawn, and a system designed not to help the poor, but to punish them for being poor. That story is coming. Don't miss it.